Now for more on NATO's military drill, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Jorge Benitez. He's the director of NATO-Source and Senior Fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. In Moscow, we have Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a Russian defense analyst, who's joining us on the phone. And also in Kiev, we have Michal Baranowski. He's the director of the German Marshall Fund Warsaw office. Welcome to you all. So this is set to be the largest war game, largest military maneuver in Europe since the end of Cold War. Lots of dangers exposed, lots of rhetoric going around. Yet U.S. official coming out saying that this is purely defensive. There's nothing to be nervous about. Let me start with Mr. Benitez there. Do you stand by that statement? This is purely defensive?
I totally do, and I think the facts speak for themselves. This exercise may seem large, but that's only because NATO has been doing very small exercises since the Cold War. In fact, just in April, the Russians themselves had a snap exercise of over 30,000 troops. So this exercise is a small exercise, and it is a purely defensive one.
And what do you think, Mr. Baranowski, joining us in Kiev?
I agree. Russians have done much larger exercises, actually practicing, among other things, nuclear attacks on NATO member states, including nuclear strike on Warsaw. We have to remember that there is nothing provocative about trying to defend members of your own alliance, while a power that is obviously being aggressive in the region, that is naming NATO member states as an enemy in its military doctrine, is being just openly aggressive to the NATO's eastern flank in particular, and they have much larger forces amassed right on our borders of Poland, the Baltic states, and let's not forget, I'm speaking to you from Kiev in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there is an ongoing war that has been started and is being perpetrated by Russia. There are Russian troops on Ukraine soil fighting a war as we speak.
Now,
so there is nothing provocative about
what let me bring in Mr.
Felgenhauer.
He's joining us on the line from Moscow. Sir, how do you make this the nature of this military drill? Do you buy that? Are you convinced that this is purely defensive in nature? Do you think that NATO is playing fire there here?
Well, of course, all sides are saying that they're in defensive posture. It was the same during the Cold War. But strategic defensive posture sometimes involves tactical offensive action, or could involve. So when they all talk about defense, that doesn't mean much. Problem is that there's a kind of build-up of tension, and to some extent forces. Up to now, there's been kind of a vacuum of kind of forces there, especially in the Baltic area, and Poland, nothing like during the Cold War when great giant armies were standing ready to attack each other. But a vacuum of forces is also kind of dangerous thing. Everyone understands it, so it's about how quickly you can fill that vacuum. And when both sides are training to fill vacuums, well, that's a movement that should be seen as provocative and could lead to unneeded additional tensions. And from the Russian point of view, especially disturbing is that some Ukrainian soldiers are also taking part in this Anaconda exercise, and that is seen as the West continuing the policy of kind of dragging in Ukraine into Western alliances, possibly into NATO, and that's seen as rather unacceptable.
And let's now take a look at the mission of Anaconda 2016. First Airborne Task Force lands in West Poland and stimulates capturing territory before moving troops and equipment through a safe passage. Then over 1,000 paratroops land to participate securing terrain east of the Vistula River. And next, I think we have the map here, engineers build a bridge over the Vistula, and troops and vehicles are expected to cross and travel to Lithuania for another exercise on June 10. So what we find here on this map is that when the drill comes to an end, Russia's Kaliningrad will be surrounded. So, Mr. Benitez, do you think that this is a message that NATO is deliberately sending there, that it is capable of doing the same that Russia has done to Crimea, and how will Russia respond?
I'm not sure your description of the activities is that accurate, because NATO is doing those things, but take a look at what they are. It is, as you said, it is starting off by an activity of dropping off paratroopers in the western part of Poland, hundreds of miles away from the Russian border, so it's not provocative. It's clearly another attempt by NATO to show that this is a defensive exercise. And you look at some of the other exercises you mentioned, such as building bridges and trying to improve the flow of NATO forces to be able to reinforce NATO allies. The problem here, and the reason for all these tensions, is because of Russia. Russia is like a thief that complains when people try to build alarm systems in their house, and then the thief complains, well, these alarm systems are being provocative and they're threatening my livelihood. Well, that's because the thief is trying to get into houses that it shouldn't be. These types of exercises are to show that NATO can protect its house, can protect its members, but they're so geographically far from Russia and of sufficient size that they're clearly not a threat to Russia.
But how capable is the NATO force now? Mr. Baranowski, how serious, this is to show European nations, of course, that NATO is serious about the security in this region, but do you think that the new allies, new partners of NATO will be convinced about NATO's forces, given what happened to Crimea, that NATO forces failed to overturn the situation there in Crimea?
There is no doubt that in case of a crisis or a war, NATO will come to the defense of all its members, including the Baltic states, Poland, and all the flank countries. What we need to do is we need to exercise. We also need to be more serious about the deterrence posture in the region, precisely because Russia has such an overwhelming force that is already on our borders. The exercise that we are talking about, Anaconda, is just showing the ability of the Western allies, including the United States, to come with reinforcements in case of something happening. But these are initially reinforcements. These are very small forces comparing to what Russia has. It's in fact about 10 Russian soldiers to one NATO soldier in the region. This is, we are moving from a posture of reassurance, just providing the sort of moral support for the countries like Baltic states and Poland, to a posture of deterrence. That is sending a clear signal to Russia that there will be in fact a very high price if they were try to do something similar to what they have done in Crimea or Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Felgenhauer joining us on the line here. So Poland and countries that border Russia, adding to what's just been said there, are very concerned with Russia's aggression in this region, and they fear that this kind of behavior will spread into their own border. That's their concern. What do you make of these concerns?
Well, look, right now the kind of threat assessment is very hazy, especially on the western side of it. They're talking about that maybe Russia will intervene to kind of try to support or maybe actually bring into the fold large Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia and Latvia. But that doesn't seem to be at all on the Russian agenda. But of course, Russia does have legitimate concerns in this region, and the main concern for already maybe 20 years has been the security of the Kaliningrad enclave, which is of course surrounded by NATO countries and could be cut off. The attachment to Russia by sea or air through international waters is also very complicated and easily interrupted. So this has been seen by the Russian General Staff in Moscow as a very dangerous point for a long time, and most Russian exercises, beginning even in the 90s, when there was President Boris Yeltsin, who was rather friendly with the West, and when Putin, who was also friendly, at least in his first term, the still Russian military were preparing exercises and possible action to defend Kaliningrad. Now it's becoming even more of a possible flashpoint, which could actually bring an unneeded, unwanted by anyone, escalation if there's some kind of incident happening there in the Baltic region, just as I don't know, two planes colliding like in, say, 2001 south of Hainan Island, American and Chinese plane collide. The same could happen over the Baltic. Could be in a serious crisis. Troops will begin to move on both sides in protective maybe manner, but this could lead to an escalation that could get totally out of hand.
Now, Mr. Benitez, your response to that, because adding to what Mr. Felgenhauer just said, another Russian official even go as far as calling this, the NATO is laying the groundwork in Eastern Europe for, quote unquote, a global strike against Russia. How do you respond to that?
I think there's no basis for those charges. Russia, as I said before, is the one that is escalating these tensions. Russia is the one that has invaded two of its neighbors in the last 8 years. Russia is the one that is violating NATO airspace and holding its exercises, these 24-hour SNAP exercises, in secret. The things NATO is doing are very different from what Russia is doing. NATO is holding smaller exercises. For example, this exercise, Anaconda, this was planned over a year ahead. Russia was invited to send observers to even see it, but Russia declined to do so, whereas Russia holds its exercises in secret. So if Russia really sincerely wants to decrease tensions in the regions, then it should do what NATO is doing rather than complain against it. It should decrease the size of its exercises, and it should be more transparent and notify people about what it is doing.
Mr. Felgenhauer, why did Russia decline to send any observer to Operation Anaconda 2016, and what do you make of the accusations that Mr. Benitez just made against Russia?
Well, trading accusations is not really a productive way of doing business. I mean, that kind should be maybe relegated to the agitprop guys, to propaganda, because, well, there is a problem, and the first thing is to recognize there is a problem. There is growing tensions, there's between militaries on both sides. Talking about trading who's more to blame does not really help at all. Diffusing the situation could have been much better. Transparency is also some of a problem because, again, there's trading and accusations. Who's more transparent? Who's allowing what? Russia says that the West is not transparent. The West says that Russia is not transparent. The black communications, exchanging accusations, and that's the course for worse confrontations in the future.
Okay. Then let me finally turn to Mr. Benitez. Your final remark on NATO's ultimate goal of mounting this military tension with Russia. How will NATO benefit from this movement, and also will NATO increase its military activities, affect U.S. devotion on its plans in Asia-Pacific?
I think there's a difference between allegations and facts. The fact is that for many years now, NATO and its members have been decreasing their defense spending, cutting their defense capabilities. But for the last 8 years, Russia has been increasing its defense spending and has been using force to take territory from its neighbors. And it's because of that that NATO is now starting in the last couple of years to increase its defense spending and try to match what the Russians are doing, to provide a defense from the Russians. And these exercises such as Anaconda and Baltops, these are to show that NATO is willing to defend peace and to stand for the defense of its members.